It would be a huge mistake for the United States to disengage from the Middle East. We have too much at stake, not only in terms of the health and security of important friends and partners, but also given the reality that insecurity in the Middle East tends not to stay in the region. It flows outside the region's borders in ways which also affect our broader interests and the interests of lots of other players in the world. But I've thought for some years that it's essential for the United States to change the terms of our engagement in the Middle East, to build a better balance of the tools that we employ, not just the use of force, but also diplomacy, development assistance, engagement, not just with governments and leaderships, but with societies as well. Because I don't believe that it's sustainable to continue to invert the roles of force and diplomacy. It's not sustainable in domestic political terms, where there are lots of American citizens who are tired of long, protracted, expensive conflicts in the Middle East and America's engagement in them. And it's not sustainable in regional terms either. President Obama and all of us who worked for him and his administration tried hard to find that balance in American strategy, and we weren't perfect. We got some things wrong, I think most painfully in Syria, where we didn't match ends to means. We set very ambitious goals, whether it was the departure of Bashar al-Assad or red lines over the use of chemical weapons, and then failed to employ the means to try to bring about those ends or those goals. But the president, I think, tried hard, both in the Iranian nuclear deal, which I continue to believe is a positive step, or was a positive step, in terms of limiting at least one layer of danger and risk that Iran's behavior posed in the region. And of course, it was essential to embed that in a wider strategy aimed at pushing back against other kinds of threatening Iranian actions. President Trump, I think, has an instinct towards disengagement from the region, but at least it's hard for me to see a coherent strategy built around that instinct. In Iran, for example, the president's impulse, his instinct clearly is to try to build greater pressure against the Iranians. I think it was a huge mistake for the United States to pull out of the Iranian nuclear deal. And the president's assumption seems to be, and the assumption of his senior advisor seems to be, that you can build sufficient pressure against Iran to either cause the regime to implode or to capitulate. And I don't think either of those outcomes are likely. I also think the president's instinct to try to produce some new American plan to solve the Israeli-Palestinian dispute is not rooted in the realities of his actions right now, because it's very difficult to see how you're going to make any progress on that issue when you don't have any active dialogue with the Palestinians or the Palestinian leadership right now. And finally, I don't think the Trump administration is paying nearly enough attention to the deeper drivers of change in the region, the lack of economic and political opportunity, the lack of dignity that helped produce the Arab revolts 7 years ago. Well, there's no question but that Iran's actions, its behavior across many different parts of the region poses a threat to American interests, the interests of friends and partners of the United States in the region. So the question has always been, how do you embed an approach to the nuclear issue in a wider strategy for dealing with that threat? I think the classic concept of containment, what the United States and our allies employed against the Soviet Union for many years in the Cold War, does have some applicability here. I mean, obviously, we're not talking about a global conflict. We're talking about a regional conflict right now. But I think it has applicability in the sense that, the Iranian regime is not 10 feet tall. There are lots of fragilities in that society, some of them economic, some of them are the difficulty that regime has in meeting the aspirations of a very young population, 70% of whom are under the age of 30. The logic of a containment approach is to push back against Iranian behavior in the region, make common cause with friends and partners, try to isolate Iran as much as you can, but also much as we did with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, engage in those areas where diplomacy can actually limit the threat. And that's what President Obama did, I think, successfully on the Iranian nuclear issue. We built a coalition within the international community which successfully isolated Iran. And it was not a coincidence that in early 2013, when we began the secret nuclear talks with Iran, that Iran was prepared to engage more seriously because the value of their currency had dropped by 50%. their oil exports had dropped by 50% as well. But we were prepared to engage seriously diplomatically, and it helped produce a result around which the international community united and which ensured that Iran was not going to develop a nuclear weapon. I think that the risk in the Trump administration's approach by abandoning the nuclear agreement is that, in a sense, we isolate ourselves, and the Iranians can play on the fact that they have lots of parts of the international community, including our most important European allies, who are sympathetic to the fact that they're holding on to the agreement as well. So I think it's possible, and it's important to contain Iran and push back against this regime's threatening behavior, and to do that with some confidence, because I think over time that regime is going to have great difficulty dealing with its internal contradictions and meeting the needs of a very young population. But I think it's a big mistake to assume that we can abandon the nuclear deal and create the kind of pressure that's going to cause that regime to either capitulate or implode. I don't think that's going to happen. In its own self-interest, I think the Iranian leadership will try to hold on to the deal as long as it can and to wait out President Trump. And I don't know how sustainable that approach is going to be, because it's going to be difficult for the Iranian government to show the economic benefits that, in a sense, it overpromised its own population as a result of the JCPOA, the nuclear deal. And I think as time goes on, there's a growing danger of collisions, whether it's between the United States and Iran, Israel and Iran, some of the Gulf Arabs and Iran as well. So I'm just not sure how sustainable the Iranian leadership's instinct in trying to hold on to the deal will be. I mean, Putin's Russia in recent years has played a weak hand in the Middle East with significant skill. I think it's a regime under Putin's leadership which has been prepared to take calculated risks, to play rough. It's demonstrated a fair amount of tactical agility, as it's done in Syria, especially since its military intervention in the fall of 2015. I think Russia has assets to bring to bear in the Middle East. It's a permanent member of the UN Security Council. It can sell sophisticated weaponry to different players in the Middle East who are interested in that. But economically, it doesn't have a lot to offer people in the region. In energy terms, it's a competitor and a rival to oil-producing states. It's not a partner. And I think the reality also is that as skillfully as Putin has played his hand diplomatically, Russia remains in relative terms a declining power. It can be very disruptive, but it's hard to see how it can contribute in an affirmative way to the future of the region. And so, I think it's a mistake to underestimate the influence that Putin's Russia can bring to bear. But it's also important to remember that a lot of times it's Putin taking tactical advantage of other people's mistakes or inactions, including American ones. Well, I'm afraid I have a fairly grim view of the landscape in Syria. It's a society and a country where pessimists, can always go to look for company or validation. Bashar al-Assad has destroyed his country in order to preserve his family's repressive regime, aided and abetted by his main outside supporters, Iran and Russia. And I think the landscape is a deeply dispiriting one right now. In the absence of some sense of long-term political transition, it's hard to see how you're going to see a large-scale return of refugees and displaced people. In the absence of that sense of political transition, it's hard to see how you're going to see large-scale reconstruction of Syria. And in the absence of that sense of political transition and the stability that might come with it over time, it's hard to see how Syria's neighbors are going to feel a real sense of security. And as long as Syria remains such a complicated and insecure landscape, it's going to be a kind of irresistible magnet for both outside players, external predators who want to fight their battles on Syrian soil, whether it's Iran and Israel, whether it's the Turks and the Kurds. And I think that's going to create over a period of years, a certain amount of insecurity as well. You have a deeply brutalized population, but I think the seeds still exist for the emergence of further domestic extremists. They may not have the acronym ISIS, but other acronyms are going to develop over time. So focusing on the importance of some kind of diplomatic resolution, a long-term political transition, I think remains extremely important. I think you're right. There is a kind of fatigue and a sense of fatalism as many Americans look at the Palestinian issue right now, a sense that it's either too hard or it doesn't matter as much as we may have thought decades ago, or a sense of complacency along with that, that somehow the status quo is sustainable indefinitely. I think those are mistaken assumptions. I think, if the two-state solution disappears, lots of people are going to pay a price. Palestinians are, because their legitimate political aspirations to have a state of their own are going to fade. I think it's hard to see how Israelis benefit from that kind of a future, in the sense that it's hard to see how you sustain a Jewish democratic state if in the area that Israel controls, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean, you have a majority Arab population, which demographic realities suggest is going to be the case in the coming years. And I think it's hard to see how some of the neighbors of Israel and Palestine don't pay a price too, like Jordan. If the two-state solution disappears, that presents a real risk, I think, to stability and to Jordan's future as well. So it's very important, I think, to fight against that sense of fatalism and fatigue and complacency, because I think all of us, including American interests, will pay a price. Well, there's certainly no shortage of challenges across the landscape in the Middle East, but I continue to believe that the core threat is really domestic dysfunction. It's the same kind of internal problems that produced the Arab revolts and the Arab Spring 7 years ago. The same sense of a lack of possibility. Economies and educational systems that aren't able to keep pace with very young populations in the region. A sense of indignity on the parts of lots of people. And I think it's another flawed assumption to think that there's such a thing as sustainable authoritarian stability. I think over time, as tired of many people in the Arab world, at least right now, are of the disorder and the uncertainty that came with those Arab revolts, the seeds are there for a repetition of that kind of unrest if leaderships and societies don't address some of those problems, the lack of political and economic opportunities. It's important and a good thing that some leaderships and some governments are trying to do that right now. They deserve the active support of the United States and other outside players. And that's why I worry that we're in an era in the Trump administration where we're not paying much attention to those kind of issues. And I don't mean to be fatalistic about this either. But my fear, in fact, my conviction is that you're going to see a recurrence of those kind of problems unless they're addressed over time. There's not going to be a made in Washington prescription. We're not very good at social engineering or nation building in the Middle East. Our recent experience has demonstrated that. But it's important to be honest and clear-eyed about the importance of undertaking within those societies and with those leaderships those kind of changes, because those leaderships and societies that try to do that have a chance of success, and those that don't are going to become brittle and break.